And look at you guys. Hardest part. So I'm just about to share my slides. Check, I have one tiny sound, so it doesn't matter if this doesn't work, but I had to check a box to install some driver, but apparently it worked. Okay. Cool, and just give me 1 minute to try to make you guys bigger, because right now I only see Jenny. There we go. Great, can you guys see my slides now?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Hey, okay. Hi, everybody. I'm glad to see you again. In case you didn't see me yesterday, I'm Katie Schuler. Is it fine if I start? Sorry. Okay, great. And today I'm going to give a tutorial on designing artificial language learning experiments for child participants. So full disclosure, this sort of thing is something that I train people on, and I have for a lot of years, but it's usually like slowly over the course of several months. And I've never really done a full-on, like, here's what you do tutorial in a short amount of time. So I tried to put in all the sort of small things that I do and change, and hopefully it'll leave you with some good tips. So first of all, has anyone done experiments with kids? Feel free to, like, I don't know, use some sort of reaction or say with your voice or use in the chat. Some people are saying no. No. Some people are saying yeah. Cool. And do you have a desire to do experiments with kids? You might if you're here for this tutorial, or you might just be curious. Maybe. So, like, one thing you can do is get a collaborator who works with kids. That's sort of the fast track. So that person might already have a lab that's really set up for some of the hard parts of running kids. But if you don't have that option, I'm going to try to walk you through what I would do. Okay, so starting point, we're actually going to start with an adult artificial language learning experiment. So this is an experiment I have adapted in my own lab, but I'm going to sort of walk you through the process of how I might adapt an existing artificial language learning experiment for adults. So this is, if you were at my talk yesterday, I talked about this paper. It's Andy Perfor's, a 2016 paper, Adult Regularization of Inconsistent Input Depends on Pragmatic Factors. So I included a link to the PDF, which you guys all don't have because you don't have my slides. So I'm just going to see if I can enter it into the chat. I'm going to feel so highly skilled if I can do this. Nope. Oh. Yep. Okay, so I just shared a link to the paper itself in case you want to refer to it later or look at it, but I'll just give a brief summary. We're just going to look at one experiment in the paper. So the crucial argument in this paper is that adults do this probability matching behavior rather than regularizing like kids, at least in part because of a pragmatic assumption that variation is predictable rather than random. So when this assumption is challenged, and that's what this experiment does, when the participants are led to believe that the input might contain mistakes, adults actually regularize more. And then Purfor's used this to argue that children might use subtle cues in the language input to determine whether to regularize variation or to match it. And I actually find this hypothesis a bit compelling, but it is difficult to take an adult experiment and then adapt it for kids or argue that kids are doing the same thing. I see someone's hand up, I think.
It's me.
Yeah, what's up?
I was just wondering if you can, so I probably should have asked this after yesterday's talk, but I was just wondering if you could unpack just a little bit why this pragmatic assumption that variation is predictable rather than random would result in probability matching real quick, just for people who aren't familiar with this stuff.
Sure. Yeah, so kids are known to regularize variation where they just often boost the most dominant form in the input, whereas adults will match the probability of variance that they were exposed to. So Purfors is arguing that in the mind of the adult, they come to the task and they have this underlying assumption about languages that variation is predictable. I think pragmatic, if you're a linguist, is probably not the word that you would choose, but this is a cognitive paper, so that's the word used here. And it really just means like an implicit assumption. So you come to the task, you're expecting the variation to be conditioned. So if anyone here has done experiments like this with adults, you probably notice anecdotally that adults will they're looking for something to condition. They'll be like, is it the animal with 5 legs compared to the animal with 4 legs? So they seem to have this expectation that the variation is triggering a change in meaning, which is a common thing that we think happens in natural language as well. When you have 2 forms, you have 2 meanings. So the idea is that adults sort of come with this assumption. And when it's challenged, if you tell them, actually the input might contain mistakes though, then they relax that bias and they instead might choose to do more regularization. Is that more clear? Yeah, so I'm going to show you a couple more things to try to walk you through it. So we're going to focus on experiment 1 in this paper, and you don't need to go reading through the paper right now. I'm going to give you a little brief summary, or try to. So in this experiment, the adults are given a set of instructions, and there's 2 different conditions of instructions. In one case, they tell them, like a normal experiment, you're going to see some pictures of common objects and their label, and your job is to just try to learn it. And if you're in the other condition, the participant condition, where they tell you it's mistakes, you get additional instructions that say the labels actually come from a previous participant who had limited time to enter their answers, and they might have made mistakes. So that's the crucial part where they're manipulating, let's change the bias and make them expect, instead of expecting something predictable, they're going to expect mistakes. There are then 200 exposure trials with a test after every 50. And the exposure trials are basically image label pairs. So you see an image on the screen, you see the label underneath, it's a stem with an affix. And then all you do is press the next button after you read it. So here we're relying on the adults to give a crap and try really hard to learn these label pairs because we asked them to. And then the test, which happens every 50 exposure trials, is actually 10 test trials, and there are 4 of them, which results in a total of 40 test trials. At the test, you see a novel 1 of the object, and you're just asked to type in the label. And that's it. So that's the whole experiment, and what they're going to assess is which affix you're choosing to use on the labels and whether you're showing regularization of the affixes. And in a second, I'm going to show you the language. Is this making sense to people? Okay, so this is what we're going to try to change. So I'm going to come back to this slide a bunch of times. So we have instructions. You either get told the input is something you should learn or told that you should learn it, but it might contain mistakes. You have 200 exposure trials, image, label, pair, and then you have 40 test trials, image, and type in the label. Okay. So there are, in this language, the underlying actual artificial language, there are 10 stems. Each stem is randomly assigned to an object, like a baby, a ball, typical random nouns. There are 10 of them. And then there are 5 affixes. So there's a main affix that you would hear, or not hear, you would see 60% of the time attached to the stem 60% of the time, and then 10% of the time you'd see each of the other 4 noise affixes, making up 100% of the input. The affixes are like this. So we have this main category. I think these are in the standard condition, which I'll show you in a minute, but the crucial ones are the noise and the similar. So this would be like one participant would get a main affix on. So that would be this person because dut on is the affix is going here. So 60% of the time they hear the main affix. If they're in a condition about noise that are typos, they'd have these 4 noise affixes. If they were in the condition called similar, the control condition, they'd have these 4 noise affixes. And the rest of these are just ways of randomizing various different combinations. So we could just focus on one line if we wanted to. So the point here is it's rather complex. It's a very simple experiment, but the language itself is rather complicated. Okay, so where we're going to start with adapting this experiment for kids is in the participants themselves, and we're going to come back to all the features of the language later. So in experiment 1, this experiment has 152 adults across 5 conditions. There's 30 adults in each condition for this 15 to 20 minute experiment. So right away, the first thing we have to do if we want to do an experiment like this with kids is reduce the number of participants. So this will take a few days to run with adults on Mechanical Turk, but this will take a few years to run with kids in the lab. So it's just not smart to choose a design where you have to run 150 kids because you're going to end up, if you're a grad student, it's going to take your entire time in grad school. And then it might inevitably not work at the end. So you want to be really careful about this. So what we're going to do first is think about how we can adapt the number and make it work for us. A couple of other things to note is that for adults, a normal dropout rate is probably like 5 per condition, maybe more online, but it's really sort of negligible online because you can just run more in a few days. For kids in person, the challenges are really recruiting that many kids and running them in person. I would find it to be a super good pace if we were running 2 to 5 kids a week. So 5 would be great, and 2 would be acceptable. So that's about how long it will take. Online, so we also run studies on Look It in my lab, which is kind of like Mechanical Turk for kids. It's ballistic in the same way. You just send it out, and then the parent records their child doing it, and then they send it back to you. So if you like Mechanical Turk, you might really enjoy Look It for kids. But dropout rates are extremely high. So kids just shut their camera off. They go to the bathroom for a really long time. Their mom helps them too much. All sorts of stuff happens, even when you try really hard to make them not happen. A good dropout rate on Look It would be about 1/3 of your participants. So if we had to run 152 adults, children to match, and that was our sample we wanted to include, we'd be looking at like 200 to maybe even 300 kids on Look It. That's going to not happen quickly like Mechanical Turk. It's also going to happen at a pace faster than in person. So at first you might get like 10 or even 20 kids in a week, but it'll start to slow down because you'll run out of the pool. And then you'll start having to sample you'll have to start sending it out normally to your own participants and recruiting that way, and it'll be slow. So it'll also take a long time, just not as long as in person. Okay, so how do we reduce this number for this experiment we want to change? The first question I would ask myself is are there any conditions we can drop? So there's 5 conditions in this experiment. Are there any that are just not very informative that I can just leave out because it's not going to contribute much to the study? The second question I would ask is, Jenny.
Sorry.
No worries, I like interruptions.
It just occurred to me, so like for those of you who are thinking like maybe I don't want to run a kid experiment, I just want to let you know that some of these considerations are actually relevant for other populations that are not the typical university populations that we run. So for example, what made me think of this is that I saw Alex nodding his head and I thought maybe Alex is thinking what I'm thinking, which is that a lot of these are the exact same things we considered when we go and run participants, for example, in Kenya. So it's just worth keeping in mind that like it's not always, you recruit them on Prolific or you recruit them on Mechanical Turk and it's as easy as that. And I know a lot of us were talking about, wanting to get participants who are not English speakers, maybe wanting to get participants of languages that have rare patterns. So if that's something you're thinking about, I think like all these things are really relevant for those populations as well.
That's
Yeah,
a super good.
Sorry, just really on that like exact same theme is just that like these are not mutually exclusive things, and like you know, it is always better to, you know, test stuff locally when you can, and especially if you're going to be testing things with kids or with populations that are going to take longer to get data from. It's always good to do piloting experiments first, and so running online experiments can be a way to sort of quickly assess what sort of bits you can you need to work on and you need to polish before you start using the precious resources of testing kids, or testing an older population, or testing a population in a place that you don't live, for example.
Yeah, these are all super good points. So testing like patient populations, older adults, languages that have more rare patterns, things that are hard, participant populations that are really hard to get, these all apply there. And yeah, I do the same thing. That's a really good point, that I would never, I do some piloting on kids, but I always pilot the design on adults online first, because there's little minor things that you just don't want to waste your kid or rare population on. And you want to make sure you work out all the kinks, and the design that you've adapted will actually function in the same way. And then you can go ahead and feel confident running it with kids.
And I think it's just worth pointing out that, like, a lot of you, I think most of you have a linguistics background. And when I started doing these kinds of experiments, I was also like a kind of more traditional linguist. And I think our instinct is to make complicated experiments. You know, we want to include everything. We're interested in lots of different things. We want the language to be rich because that's what real languages are like, and whatever. And like, that isn't really how experiments should be run. So even for, I think even for, you know, normal adult participants, it's always worth trying to think about, like, how can you minimize, like, how can you pare down your design to really be targeting exactly what you want to look at and not a million other things.
Yeah. And that also reminds me, so my background is in neuroscience, and I teach a lot of neurolinguistics classes. And I think there's another case where there's a real tangible, huge expense if you're going to do any sort of brain imaging study where you need to pay in the hundreds of dollars for every single participant that you use. But there's also seems to be a trade-off where a lot of linguists don't work in that field. And so we end up with simplifications that aren't, like, when I have linguists reading these papers in the class, they're sort of like, this isn't the kind of syntax I would have tested. So it's really important for linguists to be involved and do these things and be the ones to simplify these sorts of experiments, because you're the ones who have the information about what actually is crucial and what you need to be testing and what these sorts of language elements really are and mean. Yeah, so cool. So it's not just kids, it's a bunch of people. So the second thing I would think about is there some way we can make part of this within subject instead of between subject? And I'm going to come back and look at that in a minute, but some way where I can use the same subjects for some of the conditions. And then I also, when I'm trying to adapt an existing adult experiment, especially if it wasn't one of mine, I'll ask, is there some elaborate randomization happening here that I could reduce that's requiring me to have a lot of participants to control for the randomization? And can I reduce it a little bit or change it somehow so that I don't have to have as many participants? So here's the experiment 1 regularization results in the PER4 study. And this, I'm just focusing on the question, are there any conditions we could drop? So there were 5 conditions. There's a standard condition which has the same instructions as the experimenter. It just has distinct affixes. In the similar and typos case, we have the typos affixes. Those are the noisy ones that look like mistakes. And then we have similar, which are meant to be more of a control for the typos, I guess. So can anyone think of any of these conditions that we might be able to just axe right away? Anything popping up for you? So for me, the standard one feels like it can go, because I can see from the adult data that it doesn't actually give us any more information from the experimenter condition. It's basically the same. And in fact, the results actually say there's no difference between this condition and these two conditions. So I don't need 3 conditions that are going to show me the exact same result. So if this were me, I would just be like, let's get rid of this one, because who cares about that? Like, we can do the exact experiment we need and ask the question we need to ask without that condition. And then the next question I would ask is, can we make any part of this within subject? So what we might do is look for the similar and typos condition. And I guess we could think of a way like, is it possible for us to have a few of the axes look like typos and a few of them look distinct, and see if they regularize more away the ones that are typos and leave the ones that are more distinct? But that would be a little bit risky, I think, in this case. So if we have kids, for example, we think what we know about kids is that they're going to regularize the dominant form, maybe. And so we might expect them to regularize regardless of the affix. So I probably wouldn't make that choice here, but there are other sorts of experiments where I might. So I probably would leave with across subject the typos and similar condition for the kids. Okay, now, is there any complex randomization happening? I think the answer is probably yes. So when I see something like this, I'm sort of like, yikes. There's a bunch of, like, this is great for adults. It's a super, I mean, you look at it, this paper actually won Best Paper in Language Learning and Development the year that it was published. So it was considered to be a really great, really strong paper. The experiment design was considered to be really strong. But when I see this, I'm just sort of like, ooh, this would be so risky with kids and even with special populations, because you're going to end up in those populations with more variability in responses. So on the one hand, kids will regularize more, but we're also going to get some kids who just do random stuff that's unrelated to the task, like just like misbehaving or whatever. And sometimes by chance, you're going to get a bunch of those kids in one of these random conditions, and you're not going to have any way of knowing, like, was it this particular marker, or did I just happen to get a batch of like naughty kids who were in this group, or people who just weren't caring enough? So what I like to do, which this differs for people, but I usually prefer to do 2 or 3 languages, pseudo-random. You can hear my own voice. Just slowing down for a second. Yeah, so I usually, instead of doing a bunch of intense randomization, I usually pick 2 counterbalanced languages at most, and then I can actually check in the model, like, did one of these languages matter or not? You can also do like true randomization, but you just have to be prepared that you might have to increase your number of participants to make that happen, and you might end up with spurious things, and that's sort of a bummer. So almost always when I do true randomization with kids, I'm excited to do it at first, and I think that it looks like a way better experiment. Then once I collect the data, I'm angry with myself that I didn't just have 2 pseudo-random or 3 pseudo-random languages. Okay, so probably yes, we can probably drop a condition at least that's not really informative. We can probably make it within, probably can't make it within subject instead of between. It will definitely be a risk if we do this. So we would have to, I would want to pilot it on adults first, like we talked about before. And then we'd have to decide, like, is this risk worth the payoff? And for me, it probably wouldn't be. I'd be so afraid that I wouldn't end up with anything that I would probably just leave them in and find it a little easier to do the true experiment. There's also, you know, if you get not the same results and you've adapted the experiment a ton, then there's the chance that you can't really compare it well. And then finally, I think probably, yes, there's too much randomization going on here, and it makes me nervous. So we could instead choose to have 2 pseudo-random conditions rather than 4 truly random. So I think we might be able to do 4 conditions. We could probably reduce to 20 to 25 kids as a target. People who review papers will find this a little bit low, especially if they don't do work with kids. So, or if they don't do work with rare populations. So if they're used to doing online experiments, those folks have over the years increased their target number. So if you reviewed a paper 10 years ago, 20 was a great number, and now like 50 is a good number. But that just isn't going to apply to kid work. We're still at the same pace we were when 20 was a good number. So I would, you know, shooting for 30 would be okay, but that would take a long time. I think 20 or 25 would be quite good. So if our target's 80 to 100 kids, we'd have to run 100 to 120 or 130 to 160 online. So we've effectively like reduced by half the number of kids we would actually have to collect by making these small changes that don't really affect the design at all. Okay, so does anyone have questions about participant running before I move on to like how we're going to change the actual experiment? Okay, I'm going to ask you for ideas in this part, and everyone's quiet, so hopefully some people will chime in.
Katie, I had a question about the look it thing. Just so you said that this works like Mechanical Turk, but I realized that I think I misunderstood that. Does that mean that you post it like an experiment like Mechanical Turk and they can do it on their own time? Or do you have to log on with them and interact with the parent in real time?
You cannot interact with them via Look It.
Okay.
You could use Children Helping Science. There you can post Zoom experiments and like actually schedule them and stuff. Mm-hmm. But Look It works almost exactly like Mechanical Turk, except it records video. And if you're used to like Python or JavaScript, it's an annoying, I mean, it tries to help for people who don't program, but it's an annoying, they have all these fixed like trial types and you have to sort of force your experiment into that. It's not that hard to learn and they have a good tutorial. But basically, yes, you post your experiment. There's a review process, so they look it over and people give you feedback. So that's nice because it already gets some of the kinks worked out that way. And then they actually do the recruiting for you. So you post your experiment and then they send it to everyone in their database. You don't have access to their database on a schedule like every Friday and get all the kids who are in that age range. So the only thing you can really notice is like, wow, at first I was getting 20 kids a week and then now suddenly I'm getting like 3 kids a week or 0, and then you know that you've run out of kids in their database. Right. And then you can send you can send the link to the experiment to parents from your database, but they have to like sign up for an account and it's a little bit tricky, but yeah.
Okay, thanks.
See another hand up. Oh, I can't hear you.
So it's just that my Teams is so slow that I click unmute and it basically I click again, so I mute and unmute myself in a loop. So it's a follow-up question. So I actually have 2 like small questions. So one is whether you have some experience like doing this, because I heard some people who have done like these Zoom-based experiments with kids, and I was just wondering how it works, because I mean I imagine that it's probably very slow, like having all the participants that you want, but also I was wondering to which extent, like you would like interfere as experimenter even more in the process of like being there. So that was one small question. And the other question is like to which extent all this depends, like how difficult it is to recruit kids depends on the age group that you are looking. Because I can imagine that if you're looking, I mean, maybe this is because I work mostly on like pragmatic stuff, so the kids that are generally tested in those experiments are slightly older. But sometimes when you have like, I don't know, kids who can already like, I don't know, manipulate a tablet, for example, and maybe like it's slightly easier to do it in a way that is closer to Mechanical Turk. Yeah, so that's my 2 questions.
Yeah, so these are great questions. I actually didn't include these thoughts about online stuff. So let me just say a couple things. So first, I found Zoom to be a lot harder. So it's not as much like Mechanical Turk. It's very hard to find a situation where you can control their screen and you can interact with them. I mean, it's just complicated to make that happen well. So either the parent has to lead through it or you have to share your screen and you do all the clicking and then the kid just basically sits there and they get kind of bored. So I gave up on that in favor of just going all in on Look It because I just found it to be like not an improvement at all over in person and the same amount of effort as in person. So I have preferred to try to adapt to Look It, but for some people it still works great. It really depends on your experiment. For these really long ones, it's like kind of a drag. So kid recruiting works. I've done babies up through 12-year-olds, and I really don't notice too huge of a difference between how many kids I'm able to recruit over time. you just have to look at different places. But I've always been a part of a kid lab where we already have a large database of kids. If you're starting from scratch, I have no idea how that would happen. But yeah, look at, it is a little bit easier for like older kids who know how to use a computer, but there are trade-offs. Like 10 years ago when I was doing this kind of stuff, kids who came to the lab thought it was the funnest ever computer game. And now they're like, is this all it does? Because it's just not. I mean, they play like super fun computer games. So that can work against you. But you actually can use the parent as a research assistant. So Look It provides a little frame at the very bottom, instruction to parents. And you can actually do a good job of telling parents what you want them to do. And they really enjoy participating. If they're signing up to do it on Look It, they really want to be involved. So they'll do, if you have a way to adapt for parent instructions, they'll do what you ask. And you can sometimes get good data that way. So yeah, so it's possible to do it even with smaller kids. We've done babies, 7-month-olds on Look It. They sit on their parents' lap and like look at the screen, and we tell the parents how to interfere or not interfere. We've done 2-year-olds, and they just look at either side of the screen, and as long as it's fun enough and short enough, they'll do it. And then we've done 5 to like 8-year-olds, and they all do fine too. So you just have to adapt. But yeah.
One quick tiny follow-up on that, just because I'm curious. So when you do these preferential looking tasks with the 2-year-olds, you said, do you then code those offline, or are you using like an webcam eye tracker interface in Look It?
Definitely code it offline.
Okay.
Yeah, it would be way too hard to code live. Yeah. I don't find it takes that long though. I have tons of undergrads who really want to work in the lab and they don't mind coding. So I feel like I could invest in trying to make a computer do it, but I'd end up having to check anyway. And I'm not a research assistant anymore. So I'm like, great, they can all do the coding and they seem to like it. So it goes pretty fast. I usually don't have like more than a week before the kids get coded all the way up.
Okay, nice.
We also only code for baby looking time, change of state, which helps. So we don't code every single millisecond of what they're doing. We wait until the baby makes a change of state relevant to us. We usually use away screen and not visible or something. So they only have to log the exact precise time at a change of state, and that makes it fast. Some babies like change their state only like 3 times in a whole experiment. Yeah, so offline for sure. Okay, so let me see what I was gonna do next. Okay, so just to remind you again, we have this experiment. We've got these 2 conditions. Sometimes we say it's typos, or sometimes we say it's mistakes, sometimes we don't. Really long exposure trial where we have to read the word and match it to the picture, and we just press next. That's how we learn the language as an adult. And then the 4D test trials where we're supposed to type in the label of the novel object. And then we have the language like I showed you before. So I'm reminding you of this because what we're going to do next is focus on how we're going to change the core of the experiment, the exposures and the test, to make it accessible for kids. With some populations, special populations, you could still do written, so you wouldn't have to make this change, but for others, you actually also can't do written stuff. So it could apply there too. So we're going to focus first on the exposure phase, where there's a test after every 50. And again, we just see the pair. I just keep emphasizing this because when I read this, I was like, aha, that's never going to happen for kids, where you're supposed to trust the participant to learn these object label pairs, and they just press next when they're ready to go on, and that's it. So we're relying here on the written text and also on the subject's own internal motivation to try to learn. So it's reasonable to expect adults to have this. And on Mechanical Turk and Prolific, you can actually select the best participants. So you can even filter out the people who do a crappy job on other experiments. But for kids, we can't do that unless they participated in our own lab before. So how can we accomplish the same thing with spoken language is the first question we have to ask. We almost never can rely on kids to do reading. The second question is there a way that we can ensure the kids are attending to the image spoken label pairs? So we can't rely on them to be internally motivated to like care to learn the thing that we've exposed them to. They just won't. So we have to ensure that they're paying attention. So does anyone have any thoughts about this before I show you my favorites? Yay, I see someone typing. I'm just gonna wait until they share their thoughts. Ooh, make sure the images are colorful and fun. Sure, yeah, you could do that. Anyone else? You can also share with your voice if you want to.
Sure, I'll just do that. So
Okay.
if there's if you're playing the kids recordings, then to make sure that they've got it, you could get them to repeat it back to you, maybe?
Yeah.
Or like if the parent's there, get the parent to get them to do that.
Yep, that's exactly one of my strategies. Yep. Does anyone else have an idea they want to share before I reveal my favorites? I'll be interested to hear after I share my favorites too, what you would do that I didn't think of, or what you already do that I don't do.
I mean, I always wanted to involve stickers somehow. Stickers always. But I mean, I guess if you're not doing things in person, it's harder to do. But we're doing like an online workshop for primary school kids, and we sent the stickers to the schools.
Oh, really? Yeah, stickers are great. Stickers work. I'm going to show you some digital stickers that we use now toward the end. That's not in this part, but a little bit later. Okay, so a couple of favorites. My first one was the one that one of you shared. Repeat after me. So they see the picture and they hear the label. We'd adapt it that way, and then we'd make sure they were listening by asking them to repeat what we said. Now, depending on the kid, I mean, even adults don't really like this if you ask them to do it. They're like a little embarrassed and like, So for kids, you can help them out because we don't care how loud they say it, right? We want them to just repeat to know they're listening. So sometimes I say, if you're feeling shy, you can just whisper it. And then they'll usually warm up to doing it. And then I don't care how loud they say it. I just care that they are paying attention. Some kids, though, won't do it at all. And that's actually a good threshold of a child who's probably not going to provide very good data at all. So it's okay to ask that child, are you still having fun? Do you still want to play? And if they say no, you can use that opportunity to stop the study because they're just not going to end up revealing. We always still give them the prize in that case. My second favorite is covert to alternative forced choice. I think Jenny's used this one before. So here, we don't want them to focus on the actual part of the study we need them to learn, the actual affixes. But we could have like a covert task where they're paying attention to something else that's showing that they're actually learning. So here they would hear the STEM affix, hear the label, and then we just ask them to choose a picture. So which picture is being described? And then we can give them feedback if we want, and that makes it fun for them. They keep going. And they are learning the actual, at least the STEM in this case. And then we have a nice measure of learning, a bonus, where we can look and see over time how well they learned each of the labels. So I really like this one too. And then my third favorite is guess the word. So here, usually I use this in conjunction with one of these two first. So I have a brief exposure phase where they hear a little bit of the language in one of these circumstances. And then we have another exposure section where we have them guess the word. So we show them the label and we ask them to guess. What do you think this one is? And then they hear the word after. Now, some people find language feedback to be not natural or something. I disagree. I think that in this circumstance, you're doing exactly this. Well, people think you're doing exactly this with your brain in conversations with normal people. You're actually trying to guess what people are going to say all the time and predict what's happening next. So I don't think it's a stretch to try to predict what's going to be said about this and then hear the person actually do the labeling. That's my third favorite. Any others people want to share that I am not including here? Could be for a special population too, if you want. These are the three I always come back to, but if you think of one later, don't hesitate to share. Okay, so we'll move on now to, oops, someone's going to share, so I'll wait a minute. Include animations. That depends on how skilled you are at the Look It platform. But yeah, you definitely can. You can just show a movie and have it play at a certain point, or you can show animations, and that can work too. Yeah, but yeah, that depends on how much programming you want to do. Okay, so now we'll adapt our test, and we haven't worried about the length quite yet. We'll worry about that later. So for the test block, so here Perforce is using typed in entries. That's not going to work. And they're relying on the subject's internal motivation to do well. So they're assuming that they're going to try their best to actually type the true label that they think it is. We can't depend on kids to do that for us. And it's relying really heavily on their memory of the STEM especially. So in the analysis, they actually exclude trials where people got the STEM wrong. So we're going to ask ourselves, actually, I'm going to move forward first and show you the percent correct of adults on the exposures or on the STEM section. So Perforce asked, how correct were you at typing in the right STEM for the right label, not worrying about the affix? And what you can notice, or the first thing I would notice if I were adapting this for kids, is it's not at ceiling. So people are not perfect at this. And they're actually like, they're okay. They're at like 70-ish% across conditions, but that's going to just totally tank when we go to kids. I mean, it's going to be like maybe 10%. It's going to be very hard for them to recall 10 labels of 10 objects from memory. They're just not going to really be able to do it. So this part definitely has to be changed. So the questions I would ask myself are, again, how can we accomplish the same thing but using spoken language so they're not going to be able to just type it in for us? Is there a way that we can ensure the kids are motivated to do the task so we can make sure that they're going to try to give us the answer they think is correct rather than just doing some random thing to finish faster? And is there a way that we can lift the memory burdens? Because we don't actually care if they know the STEM, right? We care about the regularization part, or the affix part, which affixes they're going to choose. So if we can lift their burden of memory for the STEM, then we can get more tokens in our sample of data that get to stay, because we haven't used that as a metric of exclusion. Okay, so does anyone have any ideas before I share my favorites? I'll just pause for a minute. If you don't, that's okay. This part's a lot harder. So I also have 3 favorite tests for kids that I keep returning to again and again. The first one is the smiley rating scale. This doesn't always work depending on the kind of study you want, but in this case, they'd see a picture and they'd hear the label, and then they'd be asked to rate on a scale, usually from 1 to 5. I like the smiley scale. They seem to understand that well. How well the sentence matches the picture. If it definitely doesn't match, choose the red sad face. If it definitely matches, choose the green smile. If you're not sure, choose the yellow guy, and you can also choose in between if you want. That's how we usually explain it to them. So a rating scale can work really well if what you're interested in is a grammaticality judgment, which is true for a lot of people who do artificial language studies. But if you're looking for regularization behavior, often you don't want to allow them to show this sort of gradient response. What you actually want is to get them to produce the language, because they will be more likely to be able to show you what they would mark something with in a real language. So you can't always use this one, but it does work for like distributional learning style studies. My second favorite is the 2 alternative forced choice. So there's lots of ways to do it. The way that we usually do is you see a picture, and then the child would hear, and then you'd see like 2 possible choices. Remember, we have to use spoken language here, so they're going to have to hear the alternatives. So usually we'll do something like this, where there'll be 2 children or 2 little birds or 2 little doggies or something. And we'll say, this child thinks it's do ton, and this child thinks it's do 10. Who said it best? And then they have to pick which of the kids said it best. Now, there's limitations to this one. So no matter what you pick, like you might notice this is a boy and a girl, and like would all the girl kids pick the girl one? You could have two different little boys. You're always going to run into, will they pick the kid that they like better? That's just a fact. Will they pick the bird they like better? Will they pick the dog they like better? You could have two of the same kid and say, he's not sure if it's this one or this one. Which one do you think? So you could phrase it another way. Usually we highlight the child as it speaks, and Look It actually has a built-in mechanism for that, to do a highlight at a timestamp of an audio clip. So you could have it highlight the one boy and then highlight the girl. It's really impossible to do more than a 2 alternative forced choice here. So we probably couldn't use this particular design on this study if we're going to keep 4 affixes, because we'd run into trouble at the test. So we want to know if they're going to regularize the majority form. So what are we going to do? Always have the majority form be an option and then choose one of the other ones as the like foil at the test? That's going to be tricky to design. Or we could have both foils sometimes, but then we're not even giving them an option to show us regularization. The reason we can't have 4 or 5 alternatives here is because we're relying on spoken language. It would be hard even for an adult to keep track of all 5 in a spoken language alternative forced choice. And 2 is really the max you can do for kids. So it's good if you can get the 2 alternatives as close as you can in the audio stream, but it's actually helpful for the kids if you're like giving them some guidance. So saying this child thinks it's this and this child thinks it's this is okay. But you can try to get them a little closer in the stream so the child doesn't have to remember too far back. My third and final favorite is a production test where they'd actually have to say what's happening. So they'd see the picture and then we just ask them, how would you say this one? This one obviously works much better in person because you're there to like nudge them to please say it. You can ask their parent to say, you can give their parent like token words to say to try to encourage them to say the thing. But this one actually only works well for kids if you can, well, one, you could do a super long study where you expose them for like 8 days, like the Carla Hudson Cam and Newport paper. Or you can leverage their productive rule formation, and you can instead adapt the language so that you can do a WUG test. So in this case, you'd basically provide a bare stem, and then you ask them to inflect the picture. So usually I use something like plural or a case or something that it's visually clear that they must mark in this case, and the other one has a bare stem, and then they can reveal for you that they know that they're supposed to apply at affix. This is also a super bonus because you can actually use any arbitrary number of novel test items because they don't have to remember the stem. So you can just give them a totally new stem that they've never even heard, but because you provide it and they've learned the inflection, hopefully, or affix, you can test their generalization as well, which is something you couldn't do otherwise.
This is kind of just related, which is that like I think that this WUG test design is really, really good. I mean, for adults and for kids, but I know that Katie's done other stuff and so have I where you can't do that. And I think in that case, like a complete the sentence is the next best thing.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, so if you give them like a sentence frame of some sort and they just have to provide one part of it, can really help too. Yeah, for kids, like I said, if you're going to rely on their memory of something, they have to draw a full noun from a set of 10. You're going to have to do a super long study with them. And some of them are never going to be able to learn it in that short amount of time. I mean, kids are notoriously bad at like declarative memory. They're just not going to be able to learn a list of 10 things in.
I think this is why we've been talking throughout about like, can you make any adjustments to the lexicon to make it easier for them to learn? Like, can you make them affix and iconic in some way? Can you make them similar to their native language? I mean, as again, there are kind of drawbacks to that and you have to think about it. But if it's something you really have to do, then you're in the position of starting to think about, oh, what can I do to the lexicon to make it easier for people to learn? Yeah. So this is the same thing that Alex and I have done, for example, when we're testing older speakers in Kenya, try to make things a bit iconic. So yeah. Like we teach people demonstratives and we make them like, he, me, and ho-no. I bet you can guess like which is the distal demonstrative and which is the proximal demonstrative. You can do these kinds of little tricks.
Yeah. Yeah, those are super helpful. Some people really like using, for kids, using English like nouns, and you just like add whatever inflection that's made up. Other people find that objectionable. But I think, yeah, it's also a good strategy. I thought someone else was trying to share, so I'm just going to give them a second in case they want to chime in with their voice or something. No pressure. Okay, I forgot why I included this. Oh, because the next thing we're going to do is adapt the language, like Jenny was saying. So we probably can't, if we're going to choose especially the production test, if we chose one of the other options, we might be able to keep it exactly as it is. But we might want to still make some other changes to the underlying language. So for one, I'm not sure what I have on this slide. Yeah, so in the adult study, we're using STEM affix pairs, and then we're also using a lot of trials. So we have 20 trials for each of 10 nouns, and the 10 nouns make it so that you can have 6 of them occur with the most common affix, and then one of each of the other affixes. So it balances out nicely with 100% for each noun. So the first thing I would ask myself is, can I accomplish the same thing with fewer nouns? Like, one, must I have 5 affixes? Can I still show the same pattern with fewer? And 2, like, that's so many trials. What if I just had fewer nouns? Like, we could just, every noun we ax 20 trials from the exposure. So we could just say, what if we show them 6 or 5? Or is there something crucial about the 10 number? Can we reduce it at all? And what impact would that have? Again, we should pilot the same experiment with fewer nouns on adults and see if we can show the same effect. And if we can, it seems reasonable that we can just cut it a little bit. Second, is there a way that we can leverage the WUG test like we just talked about? So is there a way that we can provide a bare stem or an uninflected form of some sort and then prompt them for the inflected form? That will work a lot better for the kids if we especially want them to produce the noun. On Look It, we usually just like show them a picture of the bare noun and then do a plural or something. Then we tell the parent they can go back and play the noun again for the kid if they aren't sure what to say. Okay, so I was going to have you like get into a small group and make decisions about this, but it seems like there's a small number of people, so maybe we could just do it as a group. So what would you pick? You could chime in what you would like to do in this study, or chime in with your voice which one you think would work best. There's no right answer here. I think you could do it with any of these options. How many kids would you run? How would you adapt the experiment? How will you choose to expose the kids? Which approach do you like best? How will you test the kids? So I don't know, maybe just chime in with your voice or on the chat if you want to say which one you think will work best. If you have an experiment in mind of your own, you could say which one you think would work best for that too. What do you like? Bye. One person has to go. I can also take questions instead if that would work better for you, or I can just move on and keep going with the rest of the things. I have a higher tolerance, I'm told, than a lot of people for awkward silence. I think because my first Zoom class had 170 students and it was on a 2-minute delay from my live, the questions. So I'm like happy to wait 2 minutes for people to hear my question. But I don't think that's the case here. So maybe I'll go faster. But interrupt and stop me if you want to chime in and say something. We can always go back. Informal. Okay. We're going to see all those things again. Oh, and what changes would you make to the language? Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is address motivation. We've sort of done this a little bit with what we've already tweaked with the exposure and test. But I've said a couple times that the adult experiment is relying on the participants being motivated. So adults are typically motivated by stuff that kids aren't. And this might be true of some special populations as well, though I suspect a lot of grown-ups are motivated by money regardless. So adults will be motivated if you pay them. Usually, they often have an internal desire to perform well, so they want to get the answer right just because they want to get it right and be smart. And we can actually select those particular participants if we're online, at least. We can say, give me all the best participants who do well on studies. They're also motivated by earning points or getting feedback on what they've done. Some of these things are true for kids and some aren't. So children really lack motivation for money. They're not going to do a good job because you're paying them to. They'll take money and they think that's nice, but it's not going to change how well they perform the task or how willing they are to finish. They also lack a basic desire to perform well for the sake of it. So they're happy to like be with you and do something because you're asking them to, but they don't really have the motivation. They're more exploratory than adults. So when they're interacting with the game, they're like figuring out what it's about and they're happy to like trial and error random stuff and be wrong. And that's fun for them. Adults find that unappealing. They're sort of like, I want to do it right the first time and get what you want here. But kids are motivated by some things. So one thing, especially in in-person studies, is you personally. So children love one-on-one time with adults, especially younger children. And you being there and interacting with them and talking to them is a huge motivator for them. So just you saying, I love how you're trying your best, or I can see how well you're trying as hard as you can. They like that so much, and that will make them try harder, just focusing on how hard they're trying and doing and that you really appreciate it. So being with you helps, but we don't have that for online studies, at least with Look It. And it's a little less motivating for them when you're on Zoom because nobody likes to be on Zoom for 40 minutes. It's not the same. They're also really into earning points, just like adults, but it has to be in the form of something visual, like a sticker or something on the screen. For adults, you can be like, you got 5 out of 10 right. And they're able to like both read that and do that math and feel excited about that. And kids, you just can't, that's not going to do it. So they need a visual way of seeing their own success. So I'm going to show you some of my favorites in a minute for that. They're also motivated by feedback. So if on every trial, you can tell them whether or not they're getting something right, if that can work for your study design, that will motivate them to try harder and do better because they'll want to be right in that context. But some cases we can't provide feedback like that. And in those circumstances, they're not gonna really try hard. The other thing that really helps for kids is if there's a compelling story. So like you have to gamify it kind of, but for adults, they'll do a kind of boring study. If it's going to be 20 minutes and you're going to pay them, like it can be boring and not really make a whole lot of sense to them throughout. And they'll still be willing to be like, I mean, you'll give them a progress bar probably so they're not bored or whatever, but they'll be like, oh, I can see I'm almost done, cool. And oh, I'm at the test, cool. And for kids, it really helps if you have a whole overarching story that can propel them through the whole thing so that they're interested and motivated in making it all the way through the experiment. Okay, so I found that for children, and maybe this is true of special populations as well, definitely when I've done patient work, we also do this, that they need a kind of local trial or like small group of trial motivation, and then a more global motivation that's like propelling them through the whole experiment. So with adults, we often do this too. We'll have a visual progress bar of the whole experiment, and then we'll give them like, at every break, we'll be like, you got 10 out of 12 right, or something like that. So they're getting like periodic feedback. So I'm going to show you my 2 favorites for kids. So one is getting progress stars every few trials and then once they collect all the stars, they level up. So in this particular design, we actually have, I think there's 4 or 5 levels, and there's a whole backstory about how this alien is traveling from Earth to a new planet, and she has to learn the language as she's going. And every time you collect these 5 stars, you go up a level, and the rocket ship goes up 1 level. And then you collect 5 more stars, and it goes up another level. So it wouldn't work very well if we just had them go up a level, because we have like a lot of trials in this study every level. And that's too long. They lose their ability to feel motivated by that. And they're like, when is he going to go up another level? I'm so bored. So we incrementally throughout the level, they collect a star. In this particular study, it's if the alien Zuma falls asleep, if she gets tired, she stops practicing the language and you just click her. And if you catch her sleeping, you get a star. You always catch her sleeping. So there's no like, you can't possibly not catch her because she stops talking and you just have to click her. But the kids find that compelling enough to like make it through the study. The other strategy we often use is what I call sticker capture. So we'll usually have some sort of backstory. Let's say you had a language where you're teaching them words for like farm animals or farm vegetables or something. So we'd have a little farmer as the progress bar, and every time he gets to the next level, we'd have a sticker page, and on the sticker page, they'd all be grayed out. And when he gets to a level, he fills in that sticker, so it appears. It works really well if you can like get the outline of the sticker and have them grayed out so they can see that like, oh, the carrot is coming up next. I hope I get that one. This is inspired by in-person studies where we used to have a sticker page where you'd have like a tree with like 5 leaves and you'd have to fill on all the leaves. And they really want to finish it. So they want to collect all the things so that they can be done with the picture. So the same sort of idea will work on the computer. You can just show them at the top that like, I'm on this level. Remind them once they get to the like break and sticker collection page, like you have 3 more stickers to get, you're almost there. Or you can just say that in words or have the parent say that on Look It. And that motivates them a lot to like keep on collecting the things. It's nice if it connects a little bit to the story of your study. So it'd be weird if you were doing like random unrelated objects and then you had like a farmer here. They would sort of detect like, what's the farmer doing? Like, how is this related to the farmer? But it actually works fine if you can't too, if you can just pick some random sticker capture and progress bar guy moving along. That will work fine too. So those are the 2 I use the most. Do any of you have some that you want to share that I don't usually use or that you can think of?
I usually just use yours because you're much better at thinking about this stuff than I am. I have an utter lack of creativity when it comes to thinking about what children will find fun. I think it's challenging.
Versions of the same thing. It's basically like a global movement where they can keep track of how long basically the study will be and how far they are in it overall. So I usually make this visible on every single trial so they know like I'm at level 2. And then it helps if even if you're in person and they ask you, you can say, oh, you only have 2 more to go. See, the guy's almost there. But yeah, it's not, I mean, I'm just saying it's not that creative because it's literally 2 of the exact same thing. It's just a different way of doing it. But when you're not doing in-person studies, you can't deliver stickers live. And this really helps. I mean, to them, it feels like collecting little stickers. So it works in the same way. Again, they're not idiots. They know it's not a very fun game. So you're not fooling them. But they're like at least a little bit willing to keep going to try to collect all the things. And then they're done.
I have a question on the motivation thing, which is to do with the age of the kids that you test. So do you see a lot of variation in like what sort of age ranges does this type of motivation work best for?
Yes, not a ton. So like this sort of thing I would be comfortable using with like 4 to 12-year-olds. And the 4-year-olds would really depend on the language and the length. So yeah, for 4-year-olds, yeah, if it's super long, you're at risk of them just getting tired of doing it. But 5-year-olds will get through a whole lengthy experiment, 100 or more trials in a study like this in one day. A 4-year-old wouldn't, so you'd have to do much fewer, and a 3-year-old even less. A 2-year-old on Look It, we would do a like 3-minute study. That would be how long their attention span would be, and we'd rely on pointing or looking behavior. Then a baby, like 2 minutes, 2 minutes of sitting on a parent's lap with a bunch of like attention getters that bring them back to the screen. So it does vary, but 5 to 12 could do this. And we haven't noticed, I've tried artificial language studies, like learn a long exposure and do a test with 3 and 4-year-olds. And it's really just not worth doing, because the ones who do well give the same results as 5-year-olds. And then you end up just excluding like 1,000 kids because they can't actually make it to the end because they're just tired of doing the learning and test. So not something I've really been able to do, but I think it works fine with 5-year-olds.
All right, thanks.
Okay, I think this is one of my fun. I have a couple more points to make, but getting close to the end. So finally, addressing instructions. So so far we've adapted the exposure phase and the test phase. We've changed the language a little bit. We've changed the way we might motivate the kids to get through it. So we've added some like bells and whistles that'll make it more fun. But lots of adult artificial language learning experiments, and this experiment too, have only very brief instructions. So you can basically tell an adult, try to learn the language. We're going to test you on it later. Thanks. And that's really it. It can be real quick. But for kids, you need more lengthy instructions, and then they need a lot of reminders about what to expect so that they'll be willing to finish the experiment for you. They also require more instructions on what it is exactly you want them to do and how you want them to do it, especially on the test. Whereas adults can usually intuit, like it says type in the label. Okay, I'll type in the label. Like you don't even really have to give that many instructions. Usually you'll give them a brief like sentence reminder of what they're going to do. But for kids, practice trials are very helpful to get you the kind of data that you need. And I imagine this would be true for someone who doesn't speak the same language as you, and you might have a harder time describing to them what it is you want them to do. We use the same strategy for patients with aphasia, where we can't be sure that they're comprehending our instructions very clearly. I don't often do this, but you can also use it as a gatekeeping mechanism. So you can include some practice trials and ensure they succeed on them in order to include them in your data set. Some people do that. Okay, so kid exposure favorites, what I usually do during exposure to provide instructions for kids. So for me, native language practice is almost always my preferred approach here. So you can avoid exposing them to extra bits of your language outside of the exposure by doing it this way. So for example, in the repeat after me, I might just, we'll describe to them what they're going to do. And then we'd say, so here's a picture of a real dog. And then we'd just say, like, let's try it in English first. You already know English, right? Sometimes they say no because they don't realize that's what their language is called. But you can say, like, oh, I can hear that you speak English. Wow, you must have learned it since you were a baby. And then we'll say, okay, well, let's try it in English so you can see how it goes. You show them a picture of a dog, they hear dog, and you say, okay, all you have to do is say that. And then they say dog. So you're able to enforce that, like, yes, in fact, you have done it correctly. Yes, it's really that easy. And you just do a few of those, and then you can say, okay, now we're going to try it in the new language. And then they already know what to do. You don't waste the first few trials of them being like, what am I supposed to do? I don't really know. They feel confident and are more likely to actually do it. So it works really well for everyone. It does add time to the study, which we're always in a trade-off between, like, however long can we have this kid here and how long can we actually do the exposure. We don't want to cut too much into our exposure, but it really helps get more kids to stay in your data set and give you good data. For a 2 alternative forced choice exposure, the same sort of thing. So you could use an English practice here as well. Usually I only use one of these two. So I just say at the beginning, like, I'll show you how it's going to work. Let's try some in English, the language you already know, and then give them 2 pictures and say dog, and then say, okay, pick which one is the dog. And then they do that. So you can answer more questions for them without fear of biasing them like you would have in the exposure. They can ask you more questions that are targeted because they can use their native language and they don't have confusion. It just really helps. Usually I use at most 5 trials, sometimes as few as 1, just like, let's just try it once in English if it's super simple like this. But it really helps get them feeling comfortable doing what they're going to be doing. Same on Look It. If you have a parent who's doing it for you, it helps the parent understand, like, this is what the task is. It's super simple. It's exactly like this, except it's with this pretend language. So it helps everyone involved. And then for Guess the Word, we do the same thing. Show them a picture and say, okay, let's try it in English. Guess what this one is called. What would you call this one? And then they'll say, a baby. And you're like, yeah, you did it. And then when they get to the part, and we'll say, okay, now we're going to try it in the artificial language or in the pretend language or whatever you call it. And then they'll be more willing to do it and they understand what you mean. Native language practice is also my favorite in test changes. So for the rating scale test, we almost always provide, here's how I want you to use the rating scale. This one is the most important one to provide children with, like, show them what you want them to do. So we actually always, and we do this on Look It as well with like the computer doing it, and we ask them to choose the one we said. We demonstrate use of the rating scale. So we would use English practice. We would use like some sentences in the wrong order that were really wrong. Some way of conveying like, this is a correct sentence in English and this one is really bad and this one is kind of bad. And we say, ooh, I know that one isn't, I know you can't say that one in English, so I'm going to give them the red frowny face. And on Look It, we ask them, we highlight the red frowny face and they click it. Then we say, ooh, I definitely know you can say that in English. So let's give this one the green. And then, ooh, I'm not really sure about this one. It's kind of okay, but something feels wrong. I'm going to pick in between. So you literally show them, this is how I intend for you to use this scale. For adults, again, they just infer it. They have experience with these sorts of scales all the time. So it's not a stretch to be like, rate this one really high if it's good and rate this one really low if it's bad. But for children, it just helps them so much to deliver the results that you want them to deliver and use the scale the way you want them to use it if you just tell them. And so English practice is the way to go. To alternative forced choice, same thing. Again, you might think that this isn't necessary, but it really helps let the child ask you questions. So you just say, this one thinks it's baby and this one thinks it's baba. Which one said it best? And then they pick. And then they're able to like work out all the kinks of how it will actually work and ask you questions, try a couple. Then they feel really confident when they go into the test and not like nervous about how they're going to do. And then if they ask you questions during it, you can say, it's whichever you think. And then finally, for the production, again, we just do English practice. So we'd say, here's a dog, here's another one. This one you actually is probably the one where you need to least do this. So sometimes I skip it entirely because it's very clear to children if they've learned a productive rule, what you want them to do, even on the very first trial. But sometimes if you're not sure, you just want to give them a shot at practicing, you can do that. For only the smiley scale, we actually deliver these instructions twice. So at the very beginning of the study, we tell them, first you're going to do this, and then you're going to do this in English. And then when we get to the test, we remind them and say, remember, here's what you're going to do for the test. For all the other ones, we usually don't preview the test, but I find that just helps in that one case because it's pretty tricky for them. Okay, I think we can skip this one too because people seem a little quiet. I was just going to ask, like, what would you do or what do you use? How would you choose to do it? Does anyone happen to want to share? I don't mean to discourage you. I just don't want you to feel pressured. Have you guys done this sort of instructions adapting in the experiments in Kenya? Or do you not really have to?
We definitely have to. We definitely have to. So we work with a research assistant who's a native speaker of the local language, and he is also a teacher. And so he's definitely in the coaching people through, trying to encourage them when we sort of adapted this study to have a lot of immediate feedback on everything. So it's like you try and give a response and then you immediately get feedback on it, and then the research assistant will sort of talk you through and remind you. And we've built it in such a way that it's you got these multiple phases and it's on 2 different days. And then the actual test phase is quite short, and it really resembles all of the tasks that they've been doing throughout. So it's just they're seeing some new images, but the activity that they have to do is the same, and then they're not getting the feedback. But we keep that really short and hope that by then they've heard and heard again and heard again what we expect of them. And it somewhat works. It's just
there's a lot of dropout. I mean, not dropout, but there's a lot of exclusion.
Yeah.
6 hours. We also decided, so they're learning about some real objects, but in the experiment, their pictures, but we actually bring examples of the actual objects so that they understand that, like, okay, yes, it's a cup like this in real life.
Oh, wow.
It also, that helps with the demonstratives.
Yeah, so like, what if it was over here, or what if it was
back over there? Because we're relying on cartoon drawings for the demonstratives, which are not completely unambiguous. So the multimodal thing sort of helps.
I think one of the things we end up having to be very careful about when we have long instructions is that the person who's giving those instructions knows what they can and can't say to the participants. So that can sometimes be a tricky issue, and I'm sure that's the same for you. If you're training research assistants and you're not yourself giving the instructions to the participant, then you need to make sure they're not giving away the goose.
Yeah, so we have like the one of the ways that which I guess if you, depending on what kind of measure you have, so ours is a production task, and so the whole session is recorded, and we have to listen to everything that's happening. And fortunately, we have reduced our language to be, in the end, there's only one object and 2 colors and 2 demonstratives, and so when we have to try and listen to the recordings and make sure that the research assistant isn't giving them the multiple words in Kedaraka in this case in real time in a given trial, because then that is an exclusion point. Normally, I mean, like, yeah, normally it's about having communicated the right information to the research assistants, but it's always good when you can listen back and check.
Yeah, and sometimes it's as subtle as saying, "Oh yeah, that was great," you know, for some responses, and saying nothing for other responses. I mean, people and kids will pick up on that.
For sure.
So yeah, it needs to be, yeah, even that kind of stuff needs to be something you think about. Like, how can you, you know, if you're doing an experiment where you are kind of giving them feedback to encourage them, you know, what can and should that feedback be? So you may maybe notice Katie's feedback is always like, "Oh, you're trying really hard. That's great." You know, which doesn't give you any information about, like, "I think you did it right," or "I think you did it wrong."
That's true.
Yeah. So we always focus on trying. Actually, there's tons of research that shows that children are more motivated to work harder if you're focusing on trying, and they have more anxiety about performance if you focus on whether or not they've done well. So it works on all fronts. We also focus on saying, yeah, you're allowed to say, "I can see that you're trying your best. I really appreciate that. And all you need to do is try your best." Those are the 2 most common phrases we use. We also use, "I don't know, I actually don't speak this language." Sometimes in person, we have the kid wear headphones, and even though they're open air so we can actually hear, we pretend that we can't. And we say, "Oh, I'm not wearing the headphones, so I didn't hear, but it's whatever you think." So we do things like that where they are aware, like they think that we don't know the answer, and that really helps. We've had to think about this a lot more on Look It, though, because we have to provide the parent with actual instructions about what to say. So we tell them, if your child isn't sure, press back and let them hear it again, or encourage them to just try your best. We give them little short phrases that they can use. And then we have to do the same thing. We go through and hand code the video and make sure that some parents just can't, they just can't sit it out. So we just, yeah.
Can I ask something? I mean, it's a very naive question about about how you deal. So have you ever tested kids on a different population than maybe English speakers in the States? Because I wonder to which extent these things are also dependent on what kind of things kids are used to, you know, the way of talking to them. I know a little bit just because of the research on child-directed speech, and that it's not, I mean, it's not equal across cultures. The way, I mean, not necessarily, but yeah, I mean, I guess for the instructions, for example, I wonder if one is going to try to do an experiment with one particular population of kids, whether it's good to have some insight about how those kids interact with adults in general, because so yeah, I don't know if that changes a lot or if actually it doesn't for the purposes of the experiment.
It probably does. So when you use online studies, well, one, it would be hard for us to do a study like this, and we would definitely have like a native language informant who would help us or a cultural native who would help us, because we just wouldn't feel confident that we were doing a great job. So we'd want them to consult on all that stuff and even be the one to deliver the instructions. But online, we have to tell the parents what to do. So there, the parent will give the tone and inflection that matches hopefully what they would do in their own culture. So that can help, I guess, a little bit there if you're relying on the parent. But I'm sure it does matter to some extent. Yeah, but that's a great question and a great point. Mostly we recruit English-speaking children. And on Look It, there are rules that you have to work out with your university. So we, for example, aren't allowed to recruit outside the United States. On Look It, it's just some universities say yes and some say no. So yeah, that constrains a little bit for us, but for other people, they'd have to really think about that, I think.
I mean, I'm thinking also because in general, I think when as linguists, we, for example, obtain judgments from native speakers, even from adults. I mean, this issue of not putting a face that basically tells the person who is informing you what do you want to hear, or things like that. It's also, and how also you approach the question, because even I noticed this even in the contrast between French, English, and Spanish, and these are not that cultures that are very different. How people relate to the norm, for example, this is completely unrelated to kids, but how people relate to the norm and how much they are going to try to think that what you're actually asking is something about what is right and what is wrong actually differs. And one would think that, these maybe are all people from, European countries, and so the culture itself is not that different, but still, the relationship with the languages. So yeah. I guess these are not applied to kids, but that applies to other populations.
Yeah, it definitely applies to adults, like you're saying. I'm sure it applies to kids too. So yeah, we haven't looked at that very much or run into that, but I'm sure it's probably relevant for a lot of people, especially if you're studying other languages from other countries. So yeah. Anyone else want to chime in before I move on to my final thoughts? I can't remember what I have left, so I'm just peeking. Okay, so I'm just going to then show you, I don't know, I hope my sound will work. I just want to show you a couple of general things about doing research with kids. So sometimes these are just common misconceptions that some research assistants have when they join the lab, and we have to sort of train out of them. So there's this misunderstanding where people think that their job as a research assistant is actually to get the kid to do the task. And so often we see research assistants initially being way too enthusiastic and telling the kid it's going to be so fun and trying to convince them to do it, and just approaching it in a sort of weird way. They have this assumption that the child's not going to want to do it and that it's their job to get them to do it. And so they act weird for a lack of a better word. And children are a lot more like adults than you think. They like to be talked to in a certain way, just in the same way that adults do. They want to feel respected and valued and like they're smart people. So I want to show you this video. This is a brief video that was made to explain a research study to children. And it's actually, they took feedback from children who told them, children I think age 6 to 12, who told them how they would want a researcher to explain to them what's going to happen in a study. So this particular study is actually one that it's a clinical study, and you actually don't know you're going to be in it until after. So it's an emergency situation where you're provided with a drug or an intervention, and then after the fact, you have to be debriefed on what happened. So a lot of the research assistants in my lab, when they first start, they have this tendency, they want to try to make it seem like it was great and that they need to lie or stretch the truth or somehow explain to the kids that it was really great and then you did a really great thing. So I want to show you this so you can see how children actually want to be talked to about research. And if you can't hear it, someone let me know. Hear it okay?
Research helps us to find out the best treatments to make sick children better. Researchers do this by looking at what happens when children use the treatments. This short video is to let you know that when you were poorly, you took part in a research study. We're going to explain a bit more about what that means and who you can speak to if you have any questions. Normally, a doctor or nurse will talk about the research with a child and their parents or carers before anything happens to them. The nurse or doctor will tell them all about the research and what is involved. This is so they can decide about whether or not they'd like to take part. In an emergency, a child needs to be treated really quickly, which means there's no time to talk about the research before it happens. So, doctors are allowed to give the treatment without talking to the child and their parents or carers first. When you came into hospital, you were entered into a research study straight away. Now you're feeling a bit better, the doctor looking after you, or your parent or carer, will explain about the research and give you some information about it. If you have any questions, please ask them. You might want to ask, why is the research important, or what will happen next? You should have been given an information sheet about the research. If there's anything in the sheet that you don't understand, please ask someone to explain it to you. You can also ask them to read out the information sheet to you. The doctors and nurses involved in the research will be happy to explain things to you. Their contact details are on the information sheet. Thank you for taking part in research and for watching this video.
That's it. It's really short. So what I want you to notice is that they really focus, they're not trying to make the child feel lucky that they participated in the study or like it was super fun or anything like that, or that they should be happy they participated. Instead, they're focusing on the ground truth of the situation. Like, these are the facts about what's happening. And we want you to know that usually it's voluntary to do something like this, but it wasn't in this case. And if you have any questions, you can ask. And that's the same sort of thing that you want to convey as a researcher in the kind of studies we do. There's like a ground truth about the study. It's not really that fun. They're really doing it as a favor to you. It's totally voluntary for them to participate, and they probably have questions about it. So we do the same sort of thing with kids. We just explain to them, I'm doing this study that asks about this, and I'd love it if you would participate. You don't have to participate if you don't want to, or if you start participating and you decide you don't want to and you change your mind, that's fine. And if you have any questions, you can ask me. And then we usually say, some things you might want to ask are this or this or this, because usually they feel a little shy. But the point is, you don't have to coerce them. You're actually not allowed to coerce them to be in the study. But they respond much, much better when you just tell them, like, not as fun as a computer game, but I tried really hard to make it fun, and I'm going to be here with you, or your mom will be here with you, or your parents will be here with you to do it. And then they just know what to expect, and it goes a lot more smoothly. If you try to make it seem like no one would do this for an adult, it's going to be so great. Like, no one would ever do that. And kids just are cued into that as well, and they don't like it. So be warm with kids, but be normal. Like, don't be weird. Don't be over enthusiastic. Don't like lie about stuff. Just be as warm as you can and normal and friendly with them, like you would an adult participant. A couple other things to notice: kids are really sensitive to nonverbal communication. So don't act weird or uncomfortable. This can be hard if you don't have experience with kids, but they're not good communicators yet with words and language. They're still learning it, but they're very cued into nonverbal communication. So if you're uncomfortable, they're aware that people are uncomfortable here, and then they adapt to that situation and are like, I guess I should be uncomfortable too, because this is an uncomfortable situation. So it's really important to just be relaxed, don't act weird or odd in any way, and just like be normal, do the thing with them, and everything will be fine. Another really important thing to do is make them feel comfortable with you before you start. So many people who don't have experience with kids will like launch right into the study. if you really think about it when a participant comes in, I mean, I guess sometimes this might happen, but often you make like small talk, right? You just sort of are like, hey, thanks for coming. And did you have a long walk? And other random small things. If you're running a child in person, just make them feel comfortable with you. And it doesn't have to be like if you're not good at this sort of thing, I almost always say the exact same stuff when I was doing this. So I would just say like, do you remember my name? It's Katie. Do you have any friends named Katie? One of my participants or one of the kids that did my study had a cat named Katie, and then we laugh and like we move on. So you just make like weird small talk with little kids about like, did you walk here? Did you take the bus? Or do you know anyone with my same name? Just small things so that they feel like they kind of know you.
Can I just off of that, like this is like important advice for running adult participants as well. Like, and the advice about like saying the same small thing is like a really fantastic way to make sure that the procedure happens exactly the same way every single time. Like it puts you in the same mindset. It means that everyone had the same sort of banal like chatter or whatever. And like running participants is not the most exhilarating part of our work, but like making sure that you have a script that goes down and that everything happens the same way every time makes it easier. And I think this is like really great advice for running adult participants like in person as well.
This is making me really miss running studies in person. It's so, yeah, it's so different. It's so different, this aspect of it. Yeah, I kind of miss it now.
Especially for our work in artificial language learning, because sometimes we sit there with them the whole time, especially if you're doing a study that's a control population for kids or a special population, because with those populations, you have to sit there with them the whole time. So with adults, you have to sit there with them the whole time. So yeah, it's really important that you keep in mind all of this stuff. Another important thing to remember is, I've sort of mentioned this several times, but you should be honest and trustworthy. So they really can tell, like if you tell them like, can you play my game with me? It's gonna be super fun. You're gonna get stickers and you're gonna do all this stuff. It's gonna be great. And then like the facts are, the ground truth is your game is not fun. Like it is not as fun as Minecraft. It's not as fun as Fortnite. It's not as fun as any of the things that they are actually doing now in today's life. So as soon as they start the experiment and realize it's not fun, you already seem untrustworthy and they feel uneasy around you because you've been willing to lie to them to get them to do this thing that they maybe wouldn't have wanted to do otherwise. So it's far, far better to just tell them. I always say, like, you know, it's not that fun, but I tried to make it fun. And I really appreciate it if you try to do it. So the facts are, like, it isn't fun, but I tried my best. And I will appreciate it if you give it a try. That's really all there is. Yeah, so just don't violate their trust from the very beginning or they're gonna be weirded out and do weird stuff. Finally, if you find this really hard, if you feel like you're not good with kids or with special populations, I happen to be good with kids and I don't mind working with patients either. I'm very bad with animals though. One time I was a dog walker and I just was like, cool, I've watched kids and stuff. I can definitely walk this person's dog. And I got there and it was like the first time I was ever alone with a dog. The dog was like 10. I was like, are you like a kid? Do I talk to you like I would a kid? Are you an adolescent? Am I patronizing? Like, how do I interact with you? I was very confused. So it's normal for some people to just find this aspect of life very challenging. If that's you, it's really worth it to invest in hiring an RA that is natural with children. It's much easier to train an RA on your script for your experiment than to try to train someone who's really good at experiments to be good with kids. Just doesn't work. You'll end up spending more money and burning through time by not doing this. So like you guys were saying, it sounds like you have a person who is dedicated to running this study with your adults. If you can, like, apply for a small grant at your school or something where you can hire someone who could do this well, it will make a huge difference. And it's fine if it's not you. That's it. That's all the stuff I had to say. So feel free to ask questions about working with kids in general, other stuff, maybe about a specific experiment you want to adapt. I'd be happy to consult. Or if you guys just want to chat about like other stuff that's similar between other sorts of things. I hadn't thought about that, but it's definitely true. So I'm enjoying that part.
Thank you so much, Katie. That was great. Anybody have any further questions, things to add?
Is that the chat is muted? What does that mean?
Lord knows.
Yeah, so I think another important thing to keep in mind is like, I hope I didn't convey, well, I sort of meant to convey that it's kind of hard to do studies with kids. Like, it requires more effort. But I hope it doesn't like discourage you from doing it, because I think it's a really important thing to do. And they can give really fun and interesting data. So it's worth doing. It's good if you also run some adults, though, if you're going to choose this as your path. You can't keep up publication-wise if you just do kid studies, because you have to wait every few years to get kid publications out. So you should do both, but it's definitely worth it if you can do it.
That's good advice.
Repeating basically what I said earlier, which is that a lot of this advice is actually more applicable to regular adult populations than we think. And I'm definitely one of those people who starts with designs that are uselessly complex, and that it's like, oh yeah, because I assume that my study has to have 200 trials and all these, manipulations, and that I have to have 10 different nouns and all these things, when actually, like, I mean, I think often it comes from a place of wanting to make, I guess you said this a little bit, but wanting to make this ecological and kind of feel like a real language in some sense. And we have to remind ourselves that, we want to reduce noise in experiments, and we can often get the information that we need in much smaller, simpler designs, which also helps with analysis, which is another thing to consider. We haven't really talked very much about that in this workshop, but it should be a part of design. And yeah, so a lot of the sort of the exercise that you've done of taking this complex design and walking it through and how can we adapt this to kids, you wind up with something that is actually completely a great adult experiment, actually.
Exactly.
And it's like, this would be totally, I would be convinced like this if you got this result out of an adult experiment, and you don't necessarily need all of the complex design things. So that's also just something to keep in mind when we're designing adult experiments, to sort of be like, do I really need all of this? Do I really need every bit of this? Why am I doing these things? I think it's a really great exercise to go through and try and reduce your design a bit.
There's also like actual evidence that, like, if you're doing a mutual exclusivity study with children, for example, they never do more than 6 novel words, because there's real evidence that kids can't add 6 vocabulary items in a day to their vocabulary. So you have to be mindful of those sorts of things as well. And I don't know that we're really sure adults can like truly add to their lexicon. They can remember lists of stuff for temporary amounts of time that are lengthy, but they can't necessarily add to their lexicon 6, like more than 6 items. So that's something we should consider. I see someone's hand up. Go ahead and chime in.
Yeah, hi. Wait a minute. Okay. First of all, thank you very much for this. This was really great. And I was wondering, I'm curious about your thoughts about the possibility to compare children's and adults' behavior doing somewhat the same paradigm or the same experiment. I had trouble with that before. So obviously, a task you give children, adults would find it much, much easier, right? But then the opposite also holds. So it's really hard. I found it really hard to to find a design that you could somehow use for both types of populations in order to compare them.
Yeah, this is such a good question and so hard to answer. So I'll say that one of the advantages of doing kids is often in artificial languages, we talked about this at the coffee hour the other day, we're really worried about like implicit versus explicit learning, or reviewers are sometimes, where it's like, are the adults like actually implicitly learning this? And kids almost can't help it but do it that way. So they're not really trying explicitly to do any specific kind of learning, whereas adults are. So when I try to do this, I try my hardest to use the sort of covert version, like the covert to alternative forced choice with adults in there, because then they think they're supposed to be learning the nouns and they don't realize that they're supposed to be learning the affix, for example. And then they show a little bit more of the kid-like behavior later. But it is a really important thing to consider, and I don't really have a great answer. It's just a fact that adults and kids are gonna come to the task and treat the task in a different way. So as much as you can make it not apparent to the adults what they're supposed to be doing, they'll be left much more like the kids. But when they're aware of what they're supposed to be doing, it's definitely the case that it's way different. So that's what I usually try to do. But I don't know. I don't have a great answer for how to do exactly that. The simpler the design, the easier it is, but I don't know. Any one of you guys have any thoughts about that?
I guess that depends a lot on your measure, right? Because if you're doing a type of paradigm if you're doing an ease of learning paradigm, for example, and that can be really problematic, obviously. But if you're doing, an extrapolation paradigm, which we have spent now almost 2 days saying is the best paradigm and we should always do it, then you're at the ease of learning of the training part of the experiment is sort of irrelevant. It's like, if it's easier, great. Because what you're measuring is this extrapolation part. So I think that this is a question that really comes up with certain paradigms and maybe less with others. It might be easier to do comparisons if the paradigm allows for it.
Yeah, but even in circumstances, I think this is different than what you're talking about, but even in circumstances where, like for the WUG test one, for example, there we're sort of asking them to reveal a generalization that they've made. But some people think that the reason that adults are doing more sort of explicit things is also occurring at the test. And so, for example, some people think adults also trigger some low-level mechanism that makes them willing to do this low-level generalization, but then they have a frontal lobe that gets involved and is like, let me make a guess about what they're trying to do here and what I think the right answer is. So short of shutting that off, I don't know what you could do. You could try patients who have certain kinds of amnesia that affect only those sorts of things, to see if they look more like kids. The only trick I often use is trying to make sure that the adults don't realize them trying to get the right answer, they can execute that task bias towards something that's not the actual thing I'm trying to measure. So they think they're guessing right, but so they think it's about the nouns and they don't realize that they're providing the affix as well. I don't know. What do you guys mean by extrapolation? This is the first time I've heard this term.
I guess, am I going now? Okay. Okay. Yes. Well, so it's because we've spent a bit of time in the other sessions the last couple of days going over the sort of common artificial language learning paradigms, mostly in adults, and the different outcome measures. And so when we're talking about this extrapolation, the poverty of the stimulus version, where you train on input that's ambiguous to, for example, 2 possible underlying interpretations or rules, and then you see what people do in a disambiguating case that they haven't seen. And so then your critical test phase is actually really short, and it's only on a couple of, or it's only a few trials that are interspersed into control trials or whatever. But in those cases, what you want is complete mastery of the system that you taught them, and what you're trying to sort of figure out is what the underlying interpretation is that they had, based on what that would generate.
Yeah, I'm definitely familiar with this paradigm. I just hadn't heard the specific brand name before.
Yeah, it's definitely the brand that we're going for, extrapolation.
I like it. I will remember it. Cool.
Okay, well, I think if there aren't any other questions, thanks so much for this, Katie.
Great.
And thanks to everybody for coming, and we'll see you all tomorrow morning at 10:30 for David Adger.
Yay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.